Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another week of Behind the Mic here on Amateur Sports TV. Your host, Jonathan Hodson, back with you for another week with another chat with a sportscaster. Tonight, we're chatting with former Sportsnet Blue Jays reporter Barry Davis. We'll talk a little bit about the state of the current team, what they might do, and then we'll dive into his story, his path to Sportsnet, to the Blue Jays, of course, some memories from the playoff runs there, and then we'll get into a little broadcaster shop talk a little bit about the different forms of interviewing he's done over his career, which includes his current projects on the Out of the Park podcast and stuff like that. We'll dive into that. But before we get into that and take one more break and bring him in, we'll give you a chance to remember to follow ASTV on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, amateursports.tv. That's where you'll find all our other shows and our archives of past weeks of Behind the Mic. We'll take one more break, and we'll take our first break, and on the other side, we'll bring in Barry. Thanks for watching Behind the Mic. And we're back here on Behind the Mic on ASTV. Gives us a chance to bring in our guest this week, Barry Davis. Barry, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Jonathan, great to be talking to you, sir.
Now we've crossed paths a few times in our journeys in sports. I think the last time you and I talked was on the radio show you were doing at the time, and you invited me on as a guest.
Exactly. So now I'm paying back the favor and coming on your show. And I got to thank Jerry Howarth because he's the one who introduced us many years ago on the field at Rogers Center.
Yeah, Jerry's responsible for everything when it comes to me in baseball. That was we'll dive into that later in the show, but that was a pretty unique experience. Coming on, getting passes to hang out with the broadcast crew a couple of different times in Toronto, and you were a part of that, and just the atmosphere I always got around the broadcast crews there on both sides, the TV side and the radio side, was if you're in with one of us, you're in with all of us. And that's really the way it was with you guys. It was show up and yeah, I'm with Jerry and I'm with Bob. And it was, oh, okay, you're good. So I really appreciate it.
A real close-knit group of people, and sadly we're not all around the ballpark anymore. Jerry, myself, Mike Wilner, but it's great that you have shows like this where we can still be seen and heard.
Yeah, exactly. And so what's your life look like right now in this kind of weird mixed up year?
Well, as you can see behind me, I do spend a lot of time making music, but unfortunately that's been put on hold because of COVID. So I'm working a full-time job during the day. I sell boats and ATVs at Bass Pro Shop out here. So when I'm not doing that, I'm recording my Out of the Park podcast or my Sessions music podcast. So I am keeping pretty busy and also recording music because we can't go live anymore. So doing a lot of recording with the 2.5 bands that I'm in right now. So doing a lot, and looking forward to baseball season coming back. I need that escape.
Yep, as do we all. I think that's really important for everybody, and as it pertains to sportscasters, we don't have a whole lot of live games right now, but here's where it's important for us to be creative in finding ways to keep busy and finding new ways to keep working and keep getting better.
That's all we can do, right? We can take this time during the pandemic and mope and complain about how crappy it is, or we can try to find a way to make the best of what we have. And That's why you and I are here today, right now, right? Keep people entertained and informed.
Exactly. So, I guess since I have you on the line, I'd be remiss if I didn't get a little bit of my Blue Jays fix in. There's been a lot of there's been a lot of lip service so far this off season. Seems like the Blue Jays are in a spot where they want to start going for it again, but not a lot of movement for anybody yet. What do you see them doing, or what do you see them needing to do this off season?
Well, it is a very unique off season because last year at this time we had no idea that the season was going to be a condensed season. We had no idea that spring training was going to be interrupted and then canceled. And so this year in the off season, I think Blue Jay fans saw them get into the postseason, as short as a stint as it was, but they did get into the postseason. And the thought of possibly an expanded playoff format again next year does give you that sense, okay, then they have a shot of really building on what they did last year. I think every off season, Jonathan, Blue Jay fans start to get a little antsy around this time of year because they see, well, the winter meetings are going to get underway and there are free agents out there, and why aren't they involved? Why are they not involved? Well, it is still so early in the process right now. And a lot of the big names are still out there that are going to be out there. And one thing that I think Blue Jay fans really need to look at as something that they can be optimistic about is the fact that, unlike years past, and I'm talking, in recent years, we're seeing the Blue Jays attached to a lot of big names. Will they sign them all? No. Will they sign one or two of them? Maybe. And that's something that is really a good sign for this Blue Jays team. I know some fans get annoyed by saying, oh, all these names attached to the Blue Jays, tell me when they're actually signing somebody. Well, I think we should be happy that they're actually involved in talks with all these big name free agents, as opposed to, oh no, that's out of our price range, or we're not interested in going that route. They are interested. They do want to build. And they also have some really good assets. And when Shapiro and Atkins took over the team, there was a lot of grief from a lot of fans on, oh, they're tearing this great team apart from 2015 and 2016. But that was something that needed to be done because a lot of these players were near the end of their careers and they weren't going to be part of the future. They may help the Blue Jays be competitive maybe in 2017 and 2018, but it wasn't going to get any better than what it was. What they've done now is they stripped the team bare of what we saw in 2015 and 2016, have added a lot of good, like really good young players, and now they have assets that they could possibly trade to get a number one pitcher or to get a starting center fielder. And I'm really excited for what this offseason has in store for the Toronto Blue Jays because they can add via free agency and they can add via trade without really disrupting the main core of young players they have.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing here, the biggest positive, is that they are in a spot to put it back up. The thought that I have about it is I remember Alex Anthopoulos' first big swing, the Marlins trade in 2013,
Mm-hmm. Oh,
and
yeah.
that was a signal of, okay, we're going for it. Flashy, big names, didn't work out in the end. And kind of the way I look at it, I, as much as anybody, want them to be there now. But I'm like, all right, the playoff year was fun, but it was a 60-game year. You always see teams have a hot 50 games, 80 games, and then fall apart. We don't know what they would have done in a regular year. So my only pause is if they go gangbusters this winter, great. But we don't know if they're truly at that point yet.
And the question is, and that's a very good point you bring up, and the question is, when a team, especially a young team, gets off to a really good start and then they start to peter out in the dog days, is it because the team wasn't good enough to begin with, or is it because the team wasn't mentally strong enough to get through 162 games? I think that what the Blue Jays experienced over their 60 games will give them some confidence and some hope going into the offseason. And if you look at the mental side of the game, I think that the playoff experience will help a lot of these young players immensely. Are they ready to compete for a World Series? Not as they're constructed, but you've got, as I mentioned before, a great core with Vladimir Guerrero and Bo Bichette and Kevin Biggio and Lourdes Gurriel and, of course, Nate Pearson. So they do have a lot of young, good stud players. What they need now is they need to add a couple of players that are in the prime of their careers, guys that are maybe, between the ages of 28 and 32, that are right at the peak. And if they can add those to that young group of players, then the sky's the limit on what can happen with this Blue Jays team. But this is, again, it's all a process. And I think if you look at what happened between the years 1994 and, say, 2013, the Jays saw what they had, and they just kind of patched holes here and there. And by patching the holes, they were able to stay competitive, but they weren't good enough to get to that next level. By doing what they've done over the last 4 years, that meant a couple of years of really, really bad teams, but it also meant the opportunity of this young core growing together. Remember the Kansas City Royals of quite a few years ago? And that team was so homegrown, and they made it all the way, and they had this fantastic run, and they win the World Series, and all is great. And unfortunately, they weren't able to afford to keep their players. And that is a big key for the Blue Jays and for Ross Atkins, is they want to be able to develop these players, but they also need to keep them long term. And you want them right at the point of really exploding when you start to add in these players. And I guess the big question they need to ask themselves now is their core of young players at that point where you add a couple of big veteran key free agents, that's going to be what the team needs to get to that next level.
Exactly. Well, there's a lot of questions to be answered, but it's a fun time to be a Blue Jays fan again. So we'll see how that goes. But what I really want to get into today is I want to retrace some of your sportscasting journey on the way to getting to that point, and kind of have some fun, of course. But
Oh yeah,
allow the fan to get to know you and hopefully to educate the other broadcasters out there on what it was like for you, and some of your inside experience. So I guess we'll start off with of course, the name of our network is Amateur Sports TV. So everybody, of course, you probably 99% of what you're asked about is the Blue Jays. But what was your starting points, and what was your other stuff that that got you into it, that got you started?
Well, believe it or not, until I was 21 years old, the thought of being a sports broadcaster was really just a pipe dream. I remember when the Rogers Center first opened up, and I was in my, I would say, late teens, and maybe, no, I think it was 88, right, when the Rogers Center opened up. So I would have been 20 years old. And I remember going there with, some friends and looking at it in the broadcast booth where Tom and Jerry were and saying, one day I'd love to be in there, but I don't have any idea. How do you get there? How do you even get into the business? And at the time I was working a factory job, 40 hours a week, and playing in a band part-time. And, that was going to be my life. And I was pretty content with that, and knowing that, that dream of maybe making it big in music was there, and being a sports fan was there. And then my whole world came crashing down when I lost my job at the factory. I got laid off, and I had no idea what I was going to do. I was 21 years old. I was engaged to what would become my wife. And I remember sitting down and talking to her, and we had a really frank discussion on what the heck am I going to do with my life now. And she recommended going back to school. And I never went to college out of high school because I was in a home situation where my father had just passed away, and we needed me to work to help support the family. So I went right from high school to working this factory job. And when that was gone, that was when I, finally said, okay, maybe now I should go back to school, figure out what to do. And looking through a brochure from one of the local community colleges out here, I saw radio broadcasting, and I thought, I've always wanted to do that, and I know I can do that. So I went and applied to a college called Humber College out here, and was lucky enough to get in. And when I got in, I said to myself, there are a lot of people that are a lot younger here than I am, a lot of people that are probably just here to, play the radio game and maybe appease their parent and say, look, I'm going to school, but I'm going to take this 2-year course and I'm going to make something out of myself. I'm determined. And there was one other guy in my class that felt the same way, and his name is George Strombolopoulos. And George and I formed quite a bond at that time and said, we're going to get somewhere in this business. We're going to do it. And we just busted our butts, and we were determined. And after the first year of the 2-year course, there was a sign up on a bulletin board. It had some thumbtacks in it. It said, who was looking for a summer job in radio? And I took that sign right off the bulletin board. I brought it to the coordinator of our course. I slammed it down on his desk. I said, I want this job. How do I do it? He said, well, this is a radio station that is an oldies radio station. They have the Blue Jay games on at night, but they're mostly an oldies music station. They're looking for someone to work overnights, to sit behind the control board and play the music. And they didn't even have live DJs overnight. They were on tape. So basically, the job is called a board operator. Pays $8 an hour, and it's overnights. I'm like, I don't care. I'm in. I'll do it. So I applied for the job, and it was what would become the Fan radio. And at the time, it was like, when are you available? Can you do it? Yeah, I'm in. Okay, let's get you training, and then we'll get you on the schedule. And it was that quick. And about 2 weeks later, they said, do you know anybody else? Because we're looking for one more guy. And that's when I called George. I said, George, they're looking for one more person. And he said, well, I'm about to move to Vancouver and try to find work out there. I said, well, maybe you want to stay here because there's a job here. So he came and he started working, and we began our dream together. And we started at the very bottom. And while we were there, we said, we're going to work on our craft. We're going to do what we can to work our way through. And after the first year being there, I started in April of 92. And by September of 92, they decided to change the radio station to an all sports format, the first all sports station in Canada. And that also happened to be the year, of course, that the Blue Jays won their first World Series. So the timing couldn't have been any better. And by 1993, when the Jay season started, they needed to send some young people down there, hold a microphone in the group of players to try to get some pregame sound that they can run. And it was, would you be interested in going down there? I'm like, heck yeah. I could stand on the field pregame and stick my microphone and do these interviews. It wasn't me that was going to be on the air, but at least I could get down there. And one of the first people that I got to know, well, actually two of them, Tom Cheek and Jerry Howarth. And I talked to them. Actually, I was still going to school. I was in my second year. And I had to do a project, and it was early 1993. And I did an interview with Jerry Howarth, and he told me on tape, and I still have a reel-to-reel tape of this, of him saying, I really think the Blue Jays are kind of the type of team that can go and win it again this year. And sure enough, they did. So Jerry was asking me, what I've been doing at the Fan and the work I'm doing. And he said, well, you need to get yourself an interview with somebody, an interview that you can get that they can play so that people can hear your voice. So at the time, the Milwaukee Brewers were in town, and he said, I know just the guy. And he walks over to a very famous announcer for the Milwaukee Brewers, who was also a big movie star. You know who I'm talking about?
I have a hunch.
He was in the movie Major League.
There we go. Bob.
Yes.
Bob Uecker.
Yeah, Bob Uecker. And Jerry goes, Barry, this is Bob. Bob, this is Barry. He wants to interview you for his radio show or for the radio station. So I sat down and I had about a 15-minute chat with Bob Uecker. And I went, wow, I want to do this. And Jerry opened the door for me. And, they played that interview on the radio. And I started to go down more and more to the games. And it was a matter of after the game, you go into the clubhouse, you stick your microphone in, and then you'll bring the tape up to the booth, and then they'll play the tape on the post-game show. Well, after doing this for a few weeks, Tom Cheek said, why aren't they bringing you on the air to talk about what you experienced in the dressing room? I said, well, I don't know. They never asked me to do that. He goes, well, they should. So Tom talked to the program director at the Fan and said, we've got this young man working so hard. Why don't we let him come on the air and talk about what he saw in the dressing room? Fine, we'll do it. So because of Tom and Jerry, I got my opportunity, and that opened the door for so many things. And that began my career, in broadcasting. And it just, kind of grew and grew from there. And I had the opportunity to have covered so many things in what was 10, 11 years at the Fan Radio before I moved on to another radio station, which was supposed to be the rival that was going to put the Fan out of business. Unfortunately, 17 months after they launched, they went out of business.
How long does it take somebody like you who's walking into the room sticking a mic in someone's face? How long does it take you to get comfortable and confident in that spot?
Oh, it's one of the most challenging things for a young broadcaster reporter who's also a fan of that sport. I walk into that clubhouse and all of a sudden there's Roberto Alomar, right? And there's Joe Carter, and there's Tom Hankey, and it's like, oh my God, right? How am I going to do this? And but you learn very quickly that you have to put aside the fact that you're a sports fan. You're no longer a fan of these guys. You have to go in and talk to them like you belong there. It's just like I've heard pitchers say this, that when they make their major league debuts, that they say, oh my God, now I'm pitching to Alex Rodriguez. I was just playing against him on my PlayStation. Now I'm actually facing Alex Rodriguez. And there's that moment that you've got to say, okay, he's just a hitter, I'm a pitcher, and I know that I can get this guy out. And then all that emotion goes away and you do your job. And that was how I found it. I mean, there were a few times in my career where, all of a sudden I'm standing in front of Michael Jordan, or I'm standing in front of Wayne Gretzky, as a reporter, and you have to kind of take a moment and go, okay, this is pretty damn cool. This is pretty awesome. But, and even all during the years where I was, had been doing it for a long time, there were some actors and musicians that I had a chance to interview. And it was exciting. It was like, holy moly, I can't believe, I'm sitting here interviewing Paul Rudd after a World Series game, or I'm talking to Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam. I mean, these are like crazy exciting moments. It got to the point where, an athlete, okay, whatever, you're just an athlete. I'm used to you guys, but and if you talk to ball players, they'll tell you that if they meet other ball players, it's like, yeah, okay, that's, you're just a ball player. But if they meet an actor or musician, it's the most exciting thing in the world. Likewise, actors and musicians, when they meet ball players, they get carried away because they're so excited.
It's amazing how that works. We're going to take our first break, but after the break, I want to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the two different styles of interviewing that you've had a chance to do. And those, of course, will lead into some fun examples that people will probably remember from the Blue Jays last couple of years. So we're going to toss it to break here on ASTV. We'll be right back with more with Barry Davis. And welcome back to Behind the Mic on Amateur Sports TV. Jonathan Hodson visiting with Barry Davis. We're talking in the first block a lot about your start in the business, the early days, being the young kid stepping into the Blue Jays room. And I wanted to get into kind of the broadcaster shop talk of the different kinds of interviews that you've done, and with examples of that we saw. So, of course, a lot of fans will, of course, first remember some of the fun ones that you did around the time the Blue Jays started getting good. Of course, Kawasaki, the Biagini series. But before we get into that, when you're an in-game reporter and you're standing in the camera well for a game or investigating, what happened with that pitcher, or is he hurt? I guess a twofold question. What is your game experience? What does your game experience entail? And then when you do have a chance for two questions with a player, what's your approach?
Well, a big part of what I would do during the course of the game is obviously, Buck and Tabby would be calling the game and they would be telling you, the nuts and bolts of the game. And my job was to add a little bit of color, add a little bit of stories, let people know about who these players are as people. So a lot of my work would be done prior to games, where you would just sit down and you would talk to players and talk to them as human beings. And a lot of times you're not getting them on camera, you're just getting some stories that you can share during the broadcast. And to me, that was a big part of what I did. I wanted to bring the viewer a little bit closer to their heroes, to their favorite players, and let them know who they are. And that's really what I've tried to carry on and do with my podcast as well. But that was a big part of it. Obviously, if there was an injured player or anything that was happening, you do your best to follow up and kind of get that news. And then during the course of the game, if the Jays were going to win, then you would have, you would be interviewing a player right off the field at the end of the game. And I'd have a conversation with the producer back at the station and say, who we looking at getting. And sometimes it was an obvious choice, right? And other times there would be two or three choices. So I would kind of think about, okay, so if we talk to this guy, okay, say we're going to talk to Jose Bautista today. Well, Jose had a big game. We did this, we did that. So those interviews, you really got to keep it light because the player's just coming off the field. They call it the hero interview because you just want to get a couple of comments from them on that. But there are times where there's a walk-off win and you got to think real fast. Oh, okay, now I got to get this guy. And your plans can change real quickly. And but it's a great way. I mean, for me, I've always been one that when I watch a baseball game, I don't just watch it. From the time I was a little kid, I would always score the games. And I would do the same thing when I'm sitting in the camera bay. I'd always score the games. I always want to know exactly what's going on, try to follow. And being on the field or in the camera bay, it's a perspective because you see and hear things that you don't see and hear when you're up in the press box. And some things are things that you're not going to share because it's private stuff that you really shouldn't have heard in the first place. But a lot of times it's just another perspective on how things are going. I remember games when they were about to clinch and you look at the dugout and you could see just how nervous the guys were. You knew they knew it was imminent, but they didn't want to get overexcited yet. And I remember just watching them the first time they clinched and they were in Baltimore, and I'm looking right in the dugout as, I think it was Roberto Osuna on the mound getting the final couple of outs, and the guys nobody was sitting. And you could see everybody's legs were shaking and they were nervous, and guys kind of putting their arms around each other going, oh my God, we're getting this close, we're getting this close. And those are memories that, you don't get if you're watching on TV. And I'm so honored and blessed to have had that opportunity to be right there in the middle of it. And then, they win the game and you're in the clubhouse and you're interviewing the guys and the champagne is flying all around. I'm going to show you something, Jonathan. I still have these goggles that I wore in the clubhouse during that celebration. And I tell you what, that smell of champagne is still there. It's still there. It will never go away. These things still smell like, and I treasure these things because this is a reminder of how I had the opportunity to be a part of that celebration. I wasn't one of the players, but they were dunking me with champagne and I felt like I was part of the team, and it was an incredible experience.
Well, I'll give you one of my stories. Not that you need a story from me,
No, it's
but
great to hear.
growing up, I grew up with the Okotoks Dogs summer collegiate program, and we won our first championship in 2004 when I was 12 years old. And at the time, we didn't have much of a following in Calgary because they had just lost AAA. But the final game, like 5,000 people show up for the championship game, and we win it. And I'm 12 years old, so I don't really know, exactly what this is. I'm just the time of my life and an experience that I wouldn't have otherwise had. Afterwards, they just kind of realized that they didn't have a great place to store the trophy for 9 months. So they management emailed me, and they're like, John,
That's great.
you like the trophy? Sure. Yeah, just we'll take it when we need to give it back in the spring. I had the
That's
Western
wonderful.
Canadian Baseball League Championship trophy, sticky, smelling like old champagne, in my bedroom closet for the better part of 8 months. So I know what you
Wasn't that
mean.
fantastic though? What a great memory, right?
That's the stuff you remember when you look
Mhm.
back on it. Um,
And
so
I also look back. Go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
I was saying I'll also look back to the moment that Jose Bautista hit the bat flip home run. And at that moment, and as a reporter, your job is to be objective. Your job is to not be there as a fan. And I went through the entire playoff run doing just that. But at the moment that he hit that home run, Jonathan, I all of a sudden became that little kid who has been watching the Blue Jays since 1977. I became that little kid who, watched the 92 World Series. I became that, frustrated fan waiting for it to happen again. And the moment that ball left the ballpark for a flash, and it's captured, everyone can see it. All you got to do is look at any picture of that Jose Bautista home run, and there's this dude in a suit literally jumping. And it let loose. I couldn't control it. For a split second, it was like watching a blooper of a TV show and a actor goes out of character, right? I, for a second, was not this Barry Davis reporter from Sportsnet. I was this little kid, Barry Davis, Blue Jays fan, and I jumped. And I very quickly regained my composure, but inside I was like, it was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen, and I got to see it from that level. I will never forget that day. It will always go down as, the greatest day of my career, watching that game.
And sure, it makes an awesome story, and we can laugh at it. But isn't it important for a broadcaster, especially a team broadcaster, to stay in touch with that side a little bit?
Oh yeah.
I remember. Last time you and I were in the same building together was Seattle. I had passes
Mm-hmm. That's right.
to Seattle, and I had seen you 2 years earlier in Toronto, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
just hanging out behind the ropes, and you happen to pass by, and I look at you, and it's, oh, hey, John, how you doing?
Mm-hmm.
And anybody who's watched a Blue Jays in Seattle game knows the love affair there is there. So when you see the passion that the fan base has, isn't it, I think that's good, to stay in touch with that side yourself a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I tell you what, I did, I always tried to do whenever the Jays were in Seattle. Uh, I would make sure that I tried to, at least once a series, make the walk from the hotel to the ballpark so I could be with the fans, because everywhere you looked, people were wearing Blue Jay shirts. There were more fans in Blue Jays shirts than there were in Seattle Mariners shirts. And as you know from being at those games in Seattle, there are more Blue Jay fans than Seattle Mariner fans. And I wanted to be a part of that. And I wanted to experience what that feeling was like and just be amongst all the Blue Jay fans. And even if it was, going down to the market during the day when there's a night game and just seeing all the Blue Jay fans around enjoying the city, I loved it. I loved it, seeing their faces. And, if someone recognized you and said hello, I would take the time and talk to them because I thought it was so cool that they would make this trip to Seattle to see their team.
And something I wanted to get back to that you alluded to earlier when talking about your game day duties. You said you spent a lot of time getting to know the players. How important is that as a reporter who has a lot of close proximity and has to talk to these guys on air? How important is that to establish some kind of a relationship or at least a rapport with the people you're covering every day?
Mm-hmm. I can't stress enough how important that is as a reporter. You need to gain the trust of this athlete. You can't just be that person with a microphone that's always going to come and ask questions about why I didn't do this and why I struck out and why I, couldn't get through 5 innings. You don't want to be that person. You don't want to be the person that the player is always looking at. It's like, oh, here he comes again. So I always made it, I would start in spring training. First day of spring training. In fact, one of the things I always made sure I did in spring training was talk to the kids that had no shot at making the team, the young rookies that were there for their first camp. When all the reporters would gather around the big stars, I would go talk to these guys and say, hey, listen, welcome to the team. I'm Barry. I'm going to be around. Hopefully when you make it, you'll see me in Toronto. And, I got to know so many of the young players before they made it. I haven't covered the team now since 2016. And a lot of the players that are on that team, whether it be Danny Jansen or Rowdy Tellez or Kevin Bishop, I got to know these guys when they were just, coming up in the organization. And I found that very important. And again, just find out who they are as people and, find common interests. And, someone like a Brett Cecil, I got to know he's a big music fan. So we would just talk about music. Mark Burley was a huge hunting guy. So we would talk about, I don't care about hunting, but you talk about that kind of stuff because you want to relate to them. And then when you do need them for an interview, then all of a sudden, yeah, I'll talk to you. Yeah, to this day, when I call up former players to come on my show, because they know that I'm not going to be nagging them about things that have gone on in the game, right? We're going to have a fun conversation. And I always made it to not make an interview an interview. I made it a conversation. And that's something I learned from Jerry. And that's one thing that, I miss so much about hearing Jerry on the radio is because Jerry would not just tell you about how a player is doing. He would tell you about them as people. And I think they become a lot more relatable to a fan when you know a little bit about them as people. I'm not saying that you want to tell all their deep, dark secrets. And, some of these guys have private lives, but there are certain things that guys are more than happy to share. And I think, again, it makes them real. They're no longer just some superhero. They're actually people just like us. And I think fans love that.
Oh, that's really important. And that gives a good segue into diving a little bit deeper into what you're doing right now, as you've referenced your podcast a few times. Kind of my train of thought for that was you go from, you have opportunities to get to know them to a certain level, but when you're on air with them, a lot of times it's one-liners, quick hitters, and a lot of it's game focused. So they go from being baseball players in the TV interviews. Now on your podcast, you get to talk to them about life. How fulfilling and enjoyable is that to have these players that you used to cover as baseball players and have them come on and say, yeah, I'll talk about life with you.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I would have loved to have had that opportunity during my time at Sportsnet. But again, as you say, they would say if I was doing a pregame interview, you'd have 3 minutes tops, but we want to try to keep it to 2. Well, you really can't get into anything in that short time. And a lot of times you do something a little longer and it would get cut down because of time constraints. The only time you'd actually have the opportunity to go deeper would be in spring training. And at that point, you get full 5 minutes, Jonathan. Full 5 minutes, right? So when I left the business, and it was important for me. I'd spent 20 years, a lot of it on the road, and I missed seeing my son grow up, and he went from a baby to being in college, right? And I needed to make some changes in my life, but I didn't want to give up doing this, and this kind of gives me the best of both worlds. And when I have a player on Out of the Park, we go on for close to an hour talking to them, and we talk about everything from their childhood growing up to what it was like with the relationship with their parents when they decided they wanted to pursue this professionally. A lot of times we get into their family life and being parents and being husbands. And in the case of Brett Cecil, he opened up about a change of his life where his marriage ended and he had to look at himself in the mirror and wasn't happy with the person he was. And again, those lengthy, candid chats would not be possible if I hadn't built a relationship with these guys all those years before. So it really pays off. And for anyone who's just getting into the industry, I would give that as some really key advice is just to get to know these professional athletes as people, because the time is going to come where you might want to develop that kind of relationship with them. And I've been fortunate enough to have that with a lot of the former players and even some of the current people as well that I've gotten to know over time. So, it's a little bit different, and it's not for everybody. Some people just want to hear the numbers and the stats and, find out, what goes behind their curveball or their slider. But for what I do on Out of the Park, it's all about who they are as people. It's the human side of sports is what we call it.
And something I wanted to talk to you about was it's just part of this business, the adversity, closed doors, all that stuff. Everybody in our business is going to run into that, and not meaning to get into anything specific or anything like that, but just generalities of when the Sportsnet door came to an end. What was your experience in pivoting from, all right, I've loved this, I've done it for a long time, it's not there anymore. What was your experience of pivoting to the podcast and to a passion project that's your own?
I'm gonna be completely honest with you, Jonathan. When I left Sportsnet, I had no idea what a podcast was. Not a clue. I'd heard the term podcast, but I didn't know what it was. And a friend of mine said, because I had a few people say to me on Twitter, "Oh, you need to do a podcast now." Okay, great. Let's podcast. And then it was explained to me what it was, and I said, "Okay, we could probably try to do something like that." And the very first one I did had JP Aroncevi on as my guest, and I attempted to do the show live. And that was not an easy thing to do with very limited equipment that I have, and it was interesting to say the least. But it made me realize that I really wanted to do this and do it properly. And from the time I left Sportsnet was in January. By March, I started the podcast, and I haven't looked back since. And there have been times where I thought, do I still want to keep doing this? There's not a lot of money in it. I'm not making a living doing this. And of course, because of COVID and a lot of the sponsors I had that were, small businesses that are not in business anymore, it's been tougher. But now I do this simply for the love and the passion that I get, and being able to bring it, to whomever wants to listen and now watch, because I've learned the whole technology of video. So now I'm able to do Zoom with a lot of these players, and that gives just another dimension. We had Jason Grilli on last week, and he was giving us a tour of his new farm that he lives in and showing all his memorabilia. So that was kind of a neat little thing. But it was not a long time in between, and I learned very quickly what a podcast was, and I'm so glad. I'm so glad that I got myself into it.
So another part of Barry Davis that I think a lot of people have seen bits and pieces of is your love of music. And I'll admit that I didn't realize fully how big a part of your life that is, and until later on, and I'd met you and we start following each other on Twitter, and then I start seeing some of your musical work. Talk a little bit about that and where that came from.
Well, growing up, I grew up in a musical family. My dad was a singer and musician for many, many years. My mother was a dancer, and they actually worked together for many years. So from the time I was old enough to walk, I was walking around with either a hairbrush or a dog leash in my hand, pretending it was a microphone, and always wanted to be a singer. And I didn't really have the discipline to learn an instrument at the time. It wasn't until high school that two of my buddies were in a band together, and I wanted to sing with them, and they said, "Oh, we'd love to have you, but we need a bass player." I said, "Okay, cool. I've never played a bass before, so can you tell me how to?" So I went with them, and I went and bought my first bass, and the guitarist taught me a few things, and next thing you know, I'm playing in a band. And that became a dream of mine. And I was doing that all through, from I guess the age of 16 till around 21. And when I got into the radio business, then music kind of was like, well, a bit of a pipe dream. At least I can get $8 an hour every hour doing this thing in radio, right? So music just kind of was put aside. And I had my last live performance was probably in early 1992, right around the time I just started at the Fan. And I didn't perform again on stage for well over 20 years. And it was on stage with my son, who had learned to play drums. And I got to play guitar with him on stage. And that gave me that being on stage, I just got bit by that bug again. I said, I want to do this again. I really want to do this again. And at the time, I was still at Sportsnet, and I decided I was going to just do something in the off season and just form a band. And I've always been a huge fan of Tom Petty and Harpers, and I just seen their documentary, and I put out on social media. I said, "Hey, I'm just thinking of getting together a Tom Petty tribute band. Anybody want to get involved?" And right away, I heard from two musicians that I was in a band with back in the 80s. And I didn't talk to them much since then. And they both said, "I want to do it." And we did it. And we just started rehearsing together. And all of a sudden we thought, you know what, we can start getting some gigs. So we started doing that, and we became more and more serious. And over time, music became an even bigger part. And I started to go back and kind of fulfill a dream that I had to put on hold so many years ago. And again, I'm not making a big living doing music, but I'm able to perform. Well, pre-COVID, I was able to perform. Two bands. I've got a Tom Petty tribute. I've got a Cars tribute. And myself and my new co-host from my Out of the Park show, Tom Forth, we put together a Beatles duo where we're just, we play a bunch of before everything locked down, we're recording videos out in front of the fire in my backyard and in the patio and just having a cool thing going on. Now we're just recording. But, everything, there's a reason for everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I left, and I was unsure of.
Before we wrap up for the day, there's one more thing that I wanted to get into, and I think some of the Blue Jays fans in my life wouldn't forgive me if I didn't ask about a little bit of the backstory on a couple of things, if you don't mind diving back into some Blue Jays stuff.
Of course, I don't mind. For sure.
two of your more famous moments or series of moments, Mooney Kawasaki and the Be a Genie series. How did those come about?
Both really were organic. And I remember I had the day off the first time I saw Munenori Kawasaki being interviewed. He had hit a walk-off, and Arash Madani interviewed him. And he was so entertaining. And you know, I had seen him around, and we talked just a little bit, but I'd never interviewed him. And after I saw that, I said, this guy needs to be interviewed more often. And so we just started chatting, and you know, he was like, oh, unsure about doing it. And next thing you know, he was doing these interviews and was coming up with the funniest things. And it just became, you know, the fans loved it. The fans really enjoyed it. Be a Genie was a little bit different because Joe was in his first spring training. Jays had claimed him in the Rule 5 draft. And he walks up to me. I was in the clubhouse during spring training. He walks up to me and he's looking at the lineup. And he looks at me and goes, are you in the lineup today? I'm like, I'm not a player. He goes, oh yeah, you're way too good looking to be a player. And I looked at him and I went, you're an interesting dude. I need to know who you are. And you know, a couple days later, it turned out he ended up making the team. And I did my first interview with him, and I was like, this is great. And I've had him on the podcast a few times, and it's always a lot of fun. Haven't had him over Zoom, so that I got to do that. And I got to tell you, Jonathan, I am still trying to track down Munenori Kawasaki. I would love nothing more than to get him on the show. And man, I have not given up the fight to find him, and I'm going to find him. And it's somehow, some way, I'm going to get him on the show because, and I love the fact that, you know, it brought some joy. It was a bit of a distraction from the seriousness of everything that was going on the field. And again, showing two really unique personalities who really became fan favorites, not necessarily because of what they did on the field, but because of who they were as people.
Absolutely, and that's what I hope we've done here today. Is, of course, it's always fun to reminisce about old stories, talk a little bit of baseball, but I really wanted the viewing audience to be able to learn a little bit of something from your experiences and to get to know the person behind the broadcaster. So Barry, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate you making time. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, it's great catching up with you again, Jonathan. Stay well, and really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come on your show.
And before we head to break, if people want to check out the Out of the Park podcast and We Ain't Petty, where do people go online to find you?
Well, I would say the best place is to go to Twitter because I post pretty much everything on Twitter at Barry Davis _. And go figure, as we're doing this right now, somebody literally reposted on Twitter, because I've got Twitter in front of me, reposted one of my Munenori Kawasaki interviews. How weird and ironic is that?
Oh, man. Oh, that's good stuff. All right. Well, I'll let you go. But thanks again.
All right, Jonathan.
This was a ton of fun.
All right.
We'll be back after the break with the wrap up here on Behind the Mic. And welcome back to Behind the Mic. Jonathan Hodson back here wrapping up another week. Great conversation with former Sportsnet Blue Jays reporter Barry Davis, talking a little bit of nostalgia over the playoff runs, a little bit of broadcaster shop talk, and hopefully give you a chance to get to know a little bit of who Barry is behind the broadcasting, with the Outta The Park Podcast and his musical work. So once again, thank you so much to Barry for coming on. Just another in a long line of outstanding guests we've had. You can go to amateursports.tv to check out all our archives. You can also head to our YouTube page, ASTV on YouTube, and you can find our broadcasts on Facebook. All of those pages are ASTV. We go on ASTV, Facebook, and YouTube every Friday night at 5 Pacific, 8 Eastern. We'll be back again next week with a conversation with another sportscaster. So once again, thank you so much for tuning us in again another week. This is Jonathan Hodson. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again next Friday.